few months ago, and she put out a request to come speak to the Metro Regional Quality Council, and here I am. So always happy to um, come out and share what I know. I've learned a few things, and I know quite a bit about what's going on in the disability services landscape in Minnesota. Um, if I can just, I'm having a hard time. Okay. Can everybody see the presentation? Like one, I can't see people, so one verbal confirmation would be good.
We do.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, that's how I ended up here. So who am I? My name is Dana Eisfeld. I've been working in the field of disability employment services in Minnesota for the last 15 years. I started out at a really small organization in St. Paul called Legacy Endeavors. And it was 2010. And at the time, Legacy was a residential provider, strictly residential services, had about 10 group homes. And Ramsey County put out a grant for a pilot project for companies that might be interested in doing customized employment. So, kind of a version of supported employment, but using the discovery process. And at the time, my sister worked at Legacy, and I just had gotten home from being overseas. And she said, "Hey, we want to try this employment thing out. And it looks like they've got a really cool methodology. How about, you come on board?" And I'm like, "Well, I need a job." And I had some experience working in disability services, mostly in group homes and in-home services prior to that. And I said, "All right." So that's how I got started. And I worked as a practitioner for 5 years and really kind of helped to grow our program there, and eventually became the program's manager. And since then, I have moved on to Kaposia, which is one of the leading employment services agencies, I think, in the state. I'm proud to say that. And I'm the director of customized employment there. I'm also the co-president of the Minnesota chapter of APSE, which you're probably familiar with. But if you're not, it's the Association of People Supporting Employment First. It's a national organization that was started in 1989, and Minnesota's chapter opened in 1991. I've been the co-president for the last 7 years, and I'm finally able to hand off the reins to one of my colleagues on the board. But we're really an organization at APSE focused on inclusive employment for individuals with disabilities. So I'll talk a little bit more about Minnesota APSE as this goes on. So just kind of thinking about what I'm going to, oops, sorry about that, going to be talking about today. Really, I want to provide kind of a high-level overview of Kaposia's history and our services, but I don't want this to be an infomercial. So I'm going to add some other components in it that I thought would be helpful to, outlining, as I said before, the mission of APSE and of Minnesota APSE, and how we're trying as a state organization and as a national organization to help move the field of disability employment services forward. I'll spend some time kind of reviewing and going through the E1MN framework. So the memorandum of understanding between DHS and VRS that kind of came into play in 2021, and how that's impacted providers, and things that I think job seekers and their families might want to be thinking about in terms of how do you engage with the state employment services system as it's now set up. And then, thinking about, if you're on the waiver, you certainly are going to have access to that E1MN framework. But if you're not, and you're living with a disability or a mental health challenge, thinking about what are some of the other resources that are out there. And then, at Kaposia, I'm fortunate enough to be involved in our referral process. So my colleague, Chris Davies, who's our director of operations, and we get to do almost all the referrals, which means we meet with the families and the potential job seekers. We work with the case managers and the VR counselors. I get as much information as we can, before services get going, and then we try to match, those job seekers to our consultants that do the actual work. And through that process, over the last 3 years, I've really learned a lot about, what families and what potential job seekers are looking for in a provider, and maybe some questions folks can ask if they're looking for one or if they're looking for a different one. Maybe. And then at the end, it sounds like Joanne left some time for some Q&A. So yeah, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. Um, so I'll start off then by talking about Kaposia. So this is a young man that we helped find a job at a bike shop a number of years ago now. He's still working there in that bike store in St. Paul. And we've been around as an organization since 1963. So we have a 61-year history of supporting individuals with disabilities. Not unlike a lot of organizations at the time, in the early 1960s, I think through the 70s, as the state was moving away from the institutions, and they were closing down. Well, where did the folks go that were living there, and where were people that would have gone to the institutions? What was happening to them now? And so what you saw was the development of community-based services, right? And what that looked like as the 70s and we moved into the 80s was a really, principally at that time at least, group homes, 4, 5, 6 bed group homes for a lot of individuals. But those folks needed somewhere to go during the day that was meaningful, someplace where, they could have activities that and in some cases work that meant something to them. And so there was a group of parents that came together in the in 1963, and they formed Kaposia Day Services. So we started out as a day service organization, and that's the model that we provided through the 1970s and into the 1980s. So we were, as I said, we were founded in 1963. Today, we're dedicated to creating customized employment opportunities, and we provide retirement services for individuals with disabilities as well. About 15 years ago, we stopped taking referrals for our day services. So we still provide day services to individuals that at the time were in our day program. So we didn't want to shut it down. But now I think we're of the 400 people that we currently serve, I want to say only 25 or 30 of them are in day support services. So thinking a little bit about our organization, the real changes really began in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And it sort of happened organically. Some of the folks that we were supporting at Kaposia, they really enjoyed, activities in the community, things that were recreational and social classes at the day program, which was at the time at the neighborhood house, which is now part of the Wellstone Community Center in West St. Paul. But there was people that wanted to do something, and they wanted to work. And so we began in the very early 1980s putting together crews of people in sort of these informal jobs. Like we had a lawn crew with an old busted down military vehicle that pulled around a trailer. And I've seen photos of this that I'm hard to believe that the four pieces held together, but they went around St. Paul and they mowed people's lawns and took care of their landscaping. We had another crew of folks that was interested in cleaning. And so we put together a cleaning service that really started out with, employees and the families of the individuals supported. It was mostly their homes. But eventually through word of mouth referrals, they took on more clients. And then in 1984, that service evolved into a crew that went to the Radisson over on University Avenue and had a formal contract for cleaning services. And so that started in 1984, that kind of moving out of those informal job programs and into something where Kaposia was contracting directly with employers in the community. And it was an exciting time, for Kaposia. And in Minnesota in 1984 or 85, I want to say, Governor Perpich at the time put out a grant for supported employment providers as part of national monies that were coming through the state for organizations that really wanted to focus on, getting community-based jobs for individuals that were in the disability services system. And because we had already been doing it informally, and we're beginning to get some of those early contracts, Kaposia, along with four other organizations in the state, joined that supported employment grant. And what that grant did over the next 4 to 5 years into the late 1980s and early 1990s is it helped us by working with those other organizations and eventually getting attached to APSI. We were able to codify some of the methodologies that were most successful in moving folks, into community-based jobs. Many of them were in enclaves or job crews, but they were jobs that even at that point were paying mostly minimum wage or higher. And so as we get into the 1990s, some of those folks that we had been serving, in the day services and in those both, early informal job programs and eventually in those formal job programs, they turn 65 or sometimes a little later, sometimes a little sooner. And, they wanted to know what now? I don't really want to work anymore, but I still want to do something where I get to get up each day, go somewhere and do some things that I enjoy. And that's when we launched our retirement services in 1995. And we continue to provide those services today, mostly to individuals that are already, in our services that kind of work through their career and get to a point where, maybe they want to do activities in the community, maybe they want to do some volunteering. All of it is community based. At this point, because of the way that services changed during COVID, we're actually able to support those individuals at this point in 1 to 2 and 1 to 3 staffing ratios. Now, the big change since the 1990s and the 2000s was, as I was kind of talking about with my own experience, in 2010 and 11, Kaposia was also part of that grant program that Ramsey County put out. And that early grant program was for the discovery process or discovering personal genius. And I wasn't working for Kaposia at the time, but I got to know some of the individuals who were, because we were all involved in that grant, and then sort of the community of practice and the technical assistance center that sort of evolved out of that. And really what that did is it changed sort of the model of having sales representatives going out and talking to employers and saying, hey, this is what we were doing in the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s. What kind of jobs do you have open? Okay, you have jobs A, B, and C open. All right, let me go back to our program and find some folks that maybe have some interest in doing that. And then we would go out and sort of match jobs that way, where we would go find the job and then kind of come back and backfill it with somebody that at least had some interest in working in that particular type of business or industry. That was the supported employment model that was predominant, for those 3 decades. But as customized employment methodology started to emerge in the 2000s nationally, in the early 2010s, then, we began to adopt this process. And really the reason, I talked to our CEO, John Alexander, I asked him when I started at Kaposia 3 years ago, I said, why did we make that pivot? And he said, we were doing a really good job of finding folks jobs. The problem was that the retention rates were around 65%. And the way that we track them is kind of year over year. So if an individual on January 1st of this year is still working at that same job January 1st of next year, we would count them as somebody who retained that position. If they weren't, then we wouldn't count them. So about 30 to 40% of the people that we were able to find opportunities for competitive integrated employment in the community were within a year coming back to the drawing board. And, he said he thought we could do better, principally because we were sort of finding the jobs and then backfilling them with people in our program. What customized employment really focuses on, and what we continue to do today, is we start with the person, right? We start with the person and we have them go through the discovery process. And through that process, We learn about what they're good at. We learn about what their interests are. We learn about their ideal conditions of employment, meaning the things that they're going to need to be successful. And then we develop vocational themes, which are um, just kind of these overarching, they're not jobs and they're not businesses, but they're these overarching areas that in some way tie back to an individual's interest and skill. So maybe somebody, that is interested in working with plants, somebody that has a real passion for sport, somebody that is all about kind of health and wellness. And then we put together a list of 20 businesses under each of those themes, and we go out to those businesses and we have informational meetings with those employers, to find out not just what are the tasks that are being done and the jobs that they might have open, but all those intangibles, right? Like, what kind of environment is it? Like, is it fast paced or is it kind of more moderately or slow paced, but the quality of the work is important? Is it front facing towards the public or is it more behind the scenes work? What kind of people are they? Are they folks that are looking out for each other and, everybody's kind of part of the team and supporting each other? Or do we get the sense that it's sort of everybody for themselves? And so we do those informational meetings. And when we find an opportunity that the job seeker really wants to move forward with, and that's when we sort of negotiate with the employer, sometimes for a job that they don't even have posted. It could be for a job that we carve out that is specifically designed to fit, at least in the most important ways, the interest and skills of the individual that we're supporting. And so that's the really big difference with the customized employment methodology that we use. And in 2020, as I mentioned, a couple of things that came out of the COVID pandemic, we were able to reduce the staffing ratios for our retirement services. In addition to that, we continued providing employment, like long-term support services, to all of the folks that were considered to be in what the government was calling those essential industries. And so we modified some of that, for safety reasons, because of the pandemic, but we continue to provide services. We shut down our job searching services for about 2.5 months, but we started them back. That started in late March of 2020. We were back up and running by about June of 2020. And since June of 2020, we have had four now almost. So 21, 22, 23, and coming to the end here in 24 of the best years in our history. I counted today and we have helped 365 people find jobs between June of 2020 and December 9th of 2024. So we're quite proud of that. And really, it's been a really interesting time because the job market, as you guys know, is still really hot. If you can't turn a corner or walk into a store without seeing, a now hiring or, job openings or come to our job fair next Tuesday sign. And so we've been able to take advantage of that. And we really have the ear of the business community in ways that, I think to some degree we always have. But, when we walk into a business now and maybe they have a 40-hour-a-week job posted with these 12 responsibilities, but maybe that's been open for 6 months or a year or more. And we say to them, look, hey, this individual that I'm with today, they're looking for 15 to 20 hours a week. What if they just focused on like 5 or 6 of those responsibilities? And yeah, it doesn't fix your entire problem, but getting 20 of those hours covered and covered well is certainly going to help you out more than continuing to have that position open. So we've seen a lot of opportunities for job sculpting and job carving. And the other thing that has been really interesting is sort of the coalescence of these different factors in our field. The transition students and the high schoolers that are coming up, I go to these transition fairs now and I see 13, 14, and 15-year-olds and their parents coming out to learn about, hey, what is this going to look like in 5 years or in 8 years when they move into the adult service system? What are some things I should know about now? And so by the time we start working with them, and we work with transition age youth through VR, 18 to 21-year-olds, there's an expectation for most of them that, hey, I want to work. and there's something out there for me. And then in addition to that group of people that we're seeing entering or wanting to enter the workforce, as a result of COVID, and very unfortunately, a lot of day programs in the Twin Cities and in greater Minnesota had to close down for a period of time, or at least had to, respect the social distancing um, practices that they had to follow, and so had to reduce the number of people that could come. So what happened is a lot of the day programs ended up losing a lot of employees in that time because they weren't able to provide the services. And so, to some degree, I think, they've built back, but we continue to meet with people who, for the last 3 or 4 years, maybe they are prior to 2020 had been going to day programs for 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, and they haven't been able to go back, or they haven't been able to go back full time. And so they're saying to themselves, well, maybe, and I think they're having conversations with family members, with case managers, with VR counselors, and it's like, what else can I do? And it's like, well, maybe you could consider employment. So we're seeing a lot of folks that are in their, 30s, 40s, and even 50s that have never considered employment before, coming to us and to other organizations like Kaposia and saying, hey, I want to try to work. And I think it's kind of that, it's a really interesting time, um, because we're getting referrals for people that have all types of different, barriers and challenges that they're living with. But the only thing that, I mean, we ask a lot of questions because we want to know more about the person, but the only thing we screen for is, do you want to work? And if the answer to that question is yes, then like, come on in and let's figure it out. And there's a lot that goes into that, but fundamentally that's our philosophy and that's our mission. All right. So, talking then, I know Joanne and Sophie wanted me to talk a little bit about the services that we do provide. So I've talked about our retirement services. For customized employment through the waiver, we provide employment development services in the planning stage, which is really when we do sort of that discovery, getting to know you process. We provide job searching services, and we provide long-term support services. And we provide the similar services that VR funds. So VR calls them, what they call their services are a little bit different, but essentially that getting to know you, job searching, and on the job supports, we also provide those through VR. And our commitment, our motto at our organization is called One Step Ahead. And the reason that we say that is because Kaposia in the Dakota language means, the actual word Kaposia is a Dakota word, and it means fleet of foot. So we developed our motto of One Step Ahead, and we are really trying to continue to innovate our services. We're currently in a 2-year grant with the Department of Human Services Innovation Grants Program. And there's a couple of initiatives that we're doing. One is to start a small business program for individuals with disabilities that, want to earn income, but maybe don't want to work in traditional community-based employment. So we just started this initiative in July. We're also developing what we call a wellness for work program, where we are teaching our employees, our consultants that work directly with the job seekers and the folks that are already in jobs, about different wellness principles using wellness recovery action planning methodology. So we really try to look, even though we're the employment services provider, which is only a part of the individual's life, understanding they still go to work as a whole person, right? All of them goes to work. So for a lot of folks that have different challenges around their own wellness, like we're trying to infuse some of those practices directly into our customized employment methodology. And then lastly, we're really building out our services for transition age youth. So we started that again in 2022, and it's one of our top priorities right now because it's a little different than serving adults, because you're working very closely with the schools, you're working very closely with families. In many cases, they've always had a brick and mortar location for their son or daughter to go to. They've always have paid staff with them. And so if they're considering competitive integrated employment in the community, that's a big step. And so just, teaching our staff the types of conversations to have, the things to do for individuals that might be trying work out for the first time. Um, so those are some of the ways that we're trying to continue to innovate for the future. So we envision a world in which all people are valued and can make a contribution to the community. So I think that the overview of what I've said, I really hope kind of encapsulates that mission. So yeah, that's Kaposia. Now I'm going to move into a conversation about Minnesota APSI. So Minnesota APSI. As I said, APSI is a national organization with around, I want to say 40 or 41 state chapters. And it's an all volunteer advocacy organization that exists to raise the expectations so that people with disabilities can be employed, contribute, and assume their roles and responsibilities as citizens in their communities. Um, and we really believe that employment is the only avenue out of poverty and isolation, one person at a time. We actually just we had our strategic planning session last week. So we had our fifth, well, most of our 15 board members were there. And then, we invited some folks that are close to the mission of Minnesota APSI. And it was really interesting because we always spend the first hour kind of going over what have we done in the last year and what do we want to do for the year ahead. And what I always come away from that conversation feeling is just a lot of hope. Like despite some of the systemic issues, that we have with our service system, the turnover that we see in a lot of the provider organizations, one of my friends called it the disease of low expectations, that I think as a society, a lot of people, although I do believe that's changing, continue to have for individuals with disability. Um, I really feel that APSI brings together not just provider organizations, but self-advocates, parental advocates, stakeholder organizations, from the state and the counties, and just people that in one way or another are kind of connected to the movement of building capacity and making employment more and more possible for all Minnesotans who want it. So we have 4 committees in Minnesota APSI. So we have about 120 members across the state. We have 15 board members. All of our board members serve on at least one committee, but you don't have to be a Minnesota APSI member or even a Minnesota. I'm sorry. You don't have to be a board member or a member of Minnesota APSI to join one of our committees. We have a number of our committees have folks from other organizations whose work in some way kind of crosses over with our own. So our public policy committee, which is chaired by John Alexander, my supervisor, it tracks and influences state and national policy on employment for people with disabilities, and it collaborates to drive systems change and improve employment. So I think, of our 2 main initiatives, one of them is how do we prioritize federal and state funding for employment services? How do we help the Department of Human Services and VR create policy that incentivizes and makes providing these services easier for those organizations that want to do it? So we're very involved at the state level. We're currently, over the last few years, we've had a number of our board members involved with the Coalition for Disability Wage Justice, which is the group that was convened in 2022 to help phase out sub-minimum wages in Minnesota, and we came up one short vote in the Senate last year, 34 to 33. So I think we're on the cusp of that finally happening. Our conference and training committee, they really play an important role because what they do is they bring together different experts in the field, and we hold monthly lunch and learn sessions. We hold webinars. We hold an annual conference that is typically in one year somewhere in the metro, and then in the year in between, we will often do a series of regional conferences in different cities across the state. And so that their charge is really to help build that capacity. Our community engagement committee, what they really focus on is they work with the CTICs and the transition programs, and go to those transition fairs. And they also present regularly at conferences throughout the state. So MSSA, I hope we can get involved with the ARC of Minnesota conference, the Odyssey conference up in Duluth, the ARM conference. So where there are already other people coming together, we try to table and to do presentations at those engagements. And then our communications committee, it has two main charges, and that's to really do the marketing for the rest of the board and the activities that they're doing, and then also to tell the story of Employment First in Minnesota. And so one of the ways that we do that, we have a podcast series called the If You Believe It, You Can Achieve It podcast, hosted by Chris Davies. And we invite mostly self-advocates, but really, other professionals and experts that are involved in disability employment in Minnesota. And we just have conversations about their life stories, their lived experiences, some of the barriers and challenges that they'd had to overcome, some of the things that they wish were different, and their hopes for a better future. So we put that out 8 times a year, and it is available on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. So you can watch a video version of it on YouTube, or you can listen to it on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. As I said, we also do at Minnesota APSI a monthly Lunch and Learn series. So the third Thursday of each month from 12 to 1, we have different experts come on, and they typically will speak to a topic, for the first 30 to 40 minutes. And then we'll sort of open up a dialogue with everybody who's there, sort of a part Q&A, part just, information sharing. And it provides practical tips and resources for people that are involved. Principally, I think, the audience for this is, customized employment practitioners and middle-level managers. So that's another one of the initiatives of Minnesota APSI. Okay, so and I kind of wanted to, before I get into the E1MN, let me check the time here. Okay, we're about 33 minutes in. Before we kind of get into the E1MN Minnesota, so kind of the Employment First framework that the state of Minnesota adopted a few years ago, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we got here. It wasn't until 2014 that Minnesota, under the leadership of Governor Dayton, signed a Employment First policy, which essentially meant that Minnesota was going to prioritize competitive integrated employment as the first and preferred option for people with disabilities. Now, that doesn't mean everyone. It doesn't mean people have to work. But it should be something that if you have an inkling towards working, or if you're considering it, or if you want it, that our state funding systems, our state policy needs to prioritize competitive integrated employment options. And Minnesota APSI worked along with other stakeholders for several decades to get Minnesota to become an employment first state. And it wasn't until really the implementation of the Olmstead Act was coming to fruition in the late 2000s and early 2010s, that we really looked at that as a way to sort of ride the momentum of that and get this to be something that the governor and his administration got behind. And so it means that, in the decades since, and I've seen some of this play out, more and better collaboration between state agencies, between service providers and their respective advocacy organizations, APSI and more, and stakeholders. The policy aims to increase community inclusion and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. And I'll be the first to tell you that, we might be a decade into this, and there's certainly been a lot of progress, but we don't have the capacity. And I still don't think we have the reimbursement rates to really stabilize staffing in the field, a professional level of staffing. And, I think our policy is getting closer to a place where it is making it easier for organizations to provide these services and to provide the training that their staff are going to need in order to reach successful outcomes. But we've got a lot of work ahead of us. And I think we can maybe talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. So as part of that um, employment first movement, the VRS and DHS, with mandates from their respective federal agencies, CMS and RSA, had to come together, and they basically told Minnesota that the way the waivered service system was working prior to 2018 couldn't be the way that it continues to work, because in Minnesota, up until the late 2019s, you could use the waiver essentially to plan for services, to go out and actively job search, and for both the initial and long-term support services once on the job. But the federal government said that VR always has to be the first provider for job search services. So what that meant in Minnesota is that we had to come up with a system that is very much in its infancy on how to get the two systems to work together, how to get providers to work within those systems, and then how to create services as seamless as possible for the individuals that need those services in order to plan for, look for, and retain employment. And so this is kind of what they came up with. They also added a fourth new service called Employment Development Services Engagement. And what this first one does is that it's really for people who are on the fence about whether or not they want to work. So maybe there's somebody that's attended a day program for a number of years, and they've considered the idea of working, but what about all my friends that I still have at the day program? How would it impact my benefits? I have a bus that picks me up at my group home and brings me back every day from the day program. How would I get to and from work at a different address in the community? And so the Engage service is really set up so providers can help answer those questions for potential job seekers so that they can make informed choices about whether or not they want to look for work. Now, if they get to a point where they say, yes, I want to work, you can go right into the find phase. But what we found as a group of providers is that there's really a lot of outcomes that support planning first. And really what as I was speaking about Kaposia earlier on, we use the discovery process, which is really our customized employment planning mechanism. But really it can be any type of vocational profile or vocational planning that is done, with the job seeker so that there's a better sense of what they need to be successful and what kind of jobs to look for. When you get to the end of the planning service, at that point, and remember, this is for folks who are on the waiver, then you would move into the find service. And VR is responsible for funding the find service. And really, that's just what it sounds like. Go out and find a job. And then they'll typically fund the first 90 days of job coaching as well through VR. But VR services, as you guys probably know, are time and always have been time limited. Well, most of them are. So they don't typically provide a lot of extended or long-term supports on the job. And so if you get past those 90 days, you're stable and you're on the waiver, then you can move back to waivered employment services through what they call the KEEP service or employment support services. And you can be, you can have those services for as long as you need them. For many people, it's years. We have some folks that we provided employment support services now for 20 or more years. Typically, those services, the VRS job coaching in the beginning and then the employment support services, we're typically really involved in the beginning, as the person is learning their tasks, their routine, the transition between tasks, getting to know kind of the environment, and then learning the culture of the organization and the people. So, building relationships with their coworkers and supervisors. And we typically have it depends entirely on the person and the job that they have and how good of a fit it is, right? But, we're usually more involved in the beginning, and then over time, and it happens pretty quickly for some folks, and it takes a little more time for others, we'll transition to to check-ins where we might, once or twice a week, or even maybe every other week, or monthly for some folks, just check in to make sure everything's going well. And if it is, then great. And if it isn't, then we can kind of step in and, help that individual work through whatever it is, whether it's a performance issue or a new task they're getting trained on, or turnover in management, or what have you. Now, not everyone is on a waiver. Some folks are trying to get waivers, and it takes a long time. There's a long wait list in some counties. So some of the other options for individuals that are living with disabilities and mental health challenges are, you can go right to VRS and you can apply for eligibility, and VRS can then either provide direct service to you through their counselors or through their in-house placement staff, or VR might refer you to a partnering agency like Kaposia. So you don't have to be on a waiver. Now, VR is paying for, in this previous slide, they are paying for folks that are on the waiver and in the find phase. But if you're not on the waiver, they'll provide job counseling, job placement, and on-the-job training. And eligibility can be determined by contacting your local VR office. You can also walk into a local workforce or career force center, which are located all across the state. They offer a variety of employment services to everyone, regardless of disability status. They'll provide computers, job search assistance. They have resume writing, interview skills training. So that's really more of a kind of off the street, walk in, hey, this is what I need type service, which isn't going to be enough for some folks, but it is an option. But I would highly recommend that if you're trying to get on a waiver, or you don't have one, but you think you need support, to go to VR. So what you can do is, most of the VR counselors they actually work out of workforce centers and have offices there. So if you just type in, I live in Plymouth, what's my nearest workforce center, and reach out to them and contact them. Or you can just type in VRS eligibility in Google, Minnesota, and it'll direct you to the DEED, which is the state organization that oversees VR, to the page where you can submit an application for eligibility. So yeah, obviously the waivered support services, I think, are much more comprehensive and much more, they're going to give you a much broader and deeper scope of service. But again, if you aren't currently eligible for that, it doesn't mean that you don't have any options. Okay. I'm going to wrap up with a few slides then on, if you're looking, if you're the parent of somebody with a disability, if you yourself are looking for a new provider or a different provider, these are some of the questions that I just, that I get a lot from people that are looking at Kaposia to potentially provide services to them. So how long has your agency been providing employment services? I don't think that, how long your organization, there's always a direct correlation to the quality of and the consistency of the services that are then provided. But I do think that there is a strong correlation. If you've been at this for a while and you've weathered the different, changes in the market, the changes in our society, the changes in our social service system, I think that tells you that the company's doing something right. Another big question is, most agencies, we have a serious lack of capacity in Minnesota. Oops, I did not mean to do that. So most agencies have, and this is, I know that people know this, that it's not just employment services, it's across the board, but how long is the wait list? And if you have a case manager or you have a VR counselor, have them reach out to 3 or 4 organizations and maybe get some of these questions answered before you ever interface with them. Because that might give you a sense of, like, okay, it might be 6 months here, but they have a service I really want, or it might be 3 months here. And, so maybe I'll take a meeting with both of those companies and try to get a sense of kind of a meet and greet and get a sense of what might be the best fit for me or for my son or daughter. And then what is the staffing turnover? One of the big problems that a lot of providers across our service spectrum have, including employment, is, you just get to a point where you get to know somebody and you're doing well with them and they leave or they get promoted. So, I think it's really, some organizations don't even track this. I think the last I heard, For disability services in Minnesota, the industry standard is about 40 to 50%, which means almost half of their employees are turning over year to year, which makes it really hard for people that need those services to keep the momentum. And even if you fought and fought to get on a waiver, and then to get a competent case manager, and then to get a provider that's actually helping you with something that makes a difference in your day-to-day life, and then that person leaves. There are a few things that are more detrimental to the folks that are dependent on the service system to get to reach their life outcome. So, fortunately, our retention at Kaposia, we track this every year, has been 85 to 90% the 3 years I've been there at least. So we've been that continuity that we can provide to our service recipients, I think, is invaluable. And then ask them, what is their philosophy on inclusive employment? There's probably in the metro 50 different day or employment service organizations, and all of them are doing something a little bit different. Not all are just providing customized employment services like Kaposia. They might provide day support services. They might provide traditional supported employment, kind of more of that placement model that I was talking about. So, getting a sense from their leadership, what is their philosophy and what's their mission? And then what's your success rate? Tell me about your numbers. We work with individual people and our firm belief that it's one person, one job at a time. But as a company, we still track company goals. And our company goals are customer satisfaction, employment retention, job starts, and the number of people that are accessing our services each year, who are newly accessing our services. So I think organizations should know what their success rate is, and they should be able to share that with you and be honest about it. If they do some sort of supported or customized employment, what is their methodology? So how are they really digging down into the details about who a person is and where they are at in their life in anticipation of launching the job search? If they're telling you that the second time we meet with you, we're going to be going down to the Brooklyn Park Library and we're going to fill applications on Indeed, I would be worried. So what is their approach kind of on that point to job matching and job placement? And then, I think another thing, and I don't want to say that I think you can exist as an organization and do just fine, but the best organizations that I've worked for have leadership and have always had the philosophy of collaborating with other agencies and other organizations to learn about best practices, to share best practices, so that we together as a community can provide better services. We know there's a shortage of good service providers, so there's no sense in us looking at one another as competitors. It's not like our services at the end of the day, if we don't do them well, it's the merchandise being put on a shelf wrong. It's a person who is sitting at home and watching TV all day versus maybe going out and working 4 days a week. And I think that collaboration with other agencies and working with kind of the field at large can reinforce some of those philosophies about inclusion. If they're talking about them, then you should feel that kind of in sort of how they go about their day-to-day business. And then, I told you guys before that, the only thing that we vet for is, do you want to work? And if the answer is yes, in almost all cases, then, if the person wants to move forward with us, we will move forward with you. But different people have all different types of barriers to employment. We work with a lot of folks, obviously, that have intellectual and developmental disabilities. We work with folks that have severe and persistent mental health disorders and challenges. We have people that have co-occurring mental health and disabilities. And then folks that have disabilities and justice involvement, meaning they have criminal backgrounds. People that are on commitments that have 2-to-1 or sometimes 3-to-1 staffing at their group homes. So it's like, okay, if you're only vetting for that question, and if you're bringing those folks in, what are the strategies that you're using and the trainings that you're providing to your employees so they can be successful in helping individuals, because each person comes through with their own set of circumstances, right? And so knowing what those trainings are and knowing how you've already helped other people overcome similar barriers, I think is a really good question. And I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, we're 50 minutes in, so we have some time for Q&A. That was a lot of me talking. My mouth is dry.
This is Carrie Lakuta from the ARC, Minnesota. Dana, I just want to thank you um, for sharing your presentation with us today. Um, is Kaposia strictly like metro area, or do you service other areas of Minnesota, Southeast region, northern Minnesota, that type of thing?
Yeah, we are